they would be constantly be hearing about them, but I doubt that a lot of those guys really went into their music deep. I'm thinking, though, that, George Martin, of course, knew what they were worth, right? He, from the very beginning of working with them, he was amazed at their musical curiosity and their ability to reinvent themselves, which is not at all trivial. I think that, once again, if we take a step back and look at the macro side of things, the Beatles' biggest strength was the fact that never in their career have they said what 98% of pop artists always do, which is, oh, this was a big success, let's do this again.
Right.
Never once had they did that. They always wanted their next record to sound different from their previous record. They always wanted to move forward. They always said that, everybody, I'm guessing that, EMI would constantly tell them, especially when stuff like the stuff on Revolver was happening, they would tell them, this wouldn't work. This is not pop music. This is too experimental. What are you doing?
Right.
And, their approach was always, we don't care, if we sell less records, we want to do this. This is what we need to do now.
True artists.
Yes, this is.
There are very few bands or artists that I could think of that had that kind of approach. Yeah, like maybe Radiohead, maybe Pink Floyd. I don't know. I can't think of many others.
Yeah, that's true. There really is not a lot of bands who have that kind of, incessant moving forward. Yeah. And they were basically dragging their audience along with them, right?
Yeah.
They took their, audience of teenage girls and elevated them to a new level. I once heard a music journalist, in some interview, who was talking about the Beatles in that period, and he said, that as a teenager, when he was listening to this music, when Revolver came out, he listened to it, and he said, "Wow, so this is what's expected of me now. I need to get to their level." And that's not, that's not the business decision. That's the artist decision. And that was, back in the day when basically the business and the artist were completely separate. Nowadays, you have the business people involved. Pop music is so bland and, in a lot of instances in what we hear now that's being pushed by, like, the big record companies. It's because you have people who are involved with the bands and with the artists who are always thinking about how many singles we're going to sell, right? How many records we're going to sell. And that's the wrong thing to be thinking about.
If you want to go for something more artistic, yeah.
In that time when the Beatles were recording, they didn't know, the higher-ups in the record company, they had no idea. They were not involved in the music.
It's interesting. It's kind of like when hip hop started. Like people higher up weren't focused on it, so things just kind of happened, and that's why it was such a revolutionary period. Like in the early '80s with hip hop, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The Beatles were kind of doing all this stuff when the higher uppers were thinking about what was happening with classical albums and all these things that they were concerned with and cared about because that's the era they were brought up with. So meanwhile, underground, the kids are coming up with brand new art. Undetected almost, you know what I'm saying? Like
exactly, yes, no doubt about it. That was also what's going on in the in the late 50s when the Beatles were coming up, right?
Yeah.
You had I'm
sure it's happening now with some sort of new with like indie.
No, it's been happening now for a while, but the thing is that now everybody can make a record, right? You can make a record in your own home, and you don't have to luck out on somebody like George Martin
to find you,
to take a chance on you. Right? You can just put out your own stuff and be moderately successful, rather than taking over the world like they did. I don't think that can happen again.
The closest thing I've seen recently is Billie Eilish. I don't know if you've heard it.
Yeah, I've heard it.
It's so bizarre, and so it's like a teenager in a bedroom with her older brother making like bedroom record that's super bizarre, but it's like the number one album right now.
It's pretty good. Yeah, I've heard it. I've heard her, her previous record and the one that she's promoting now.
Yeah,
I liked it. I like them both.
It's just interesting. But it's interesting that like that can happen, I guess, a little bit now. It's not gonna. I don't think it can ever happen.
No, it happened before with Lorde as well. When you think about the teenage girls who all of a sudden introduce a new sound into the mainstream.
Right.
A few years ago that happened with Lorde, right? When she put out Royals, I think she was like 15 years old.
Wow.
Which was also a very unusual sound for the time, a very sparse and unusual sound.
Yeah.
But neither her nor Billie Eilish, I believe, can be, as big as the Beatles were.
Right. They became the culture.
Yeah, I don't think anyone can, nowadays you just have too much stuff.
Right, exactly.
Back then it was really, they just put the entire culture on its head. It wasn't just music. It was the way they behaved and acted, which was revolutionary as well. Because when you look at like interviews of guys like Cliff Richards, they're contemporaries in a way that were pop stars before they became the pop stars.
Yeah.
It's a completely different kind of dynamic. They were very much, thinking of the bottom line. They were trying to present themselves as squeaky clean, very polished kind of artists. And when you look at like an interview of like a TV interviewer interviewing someone like Cliff, right, it would be a very master-servant kind of relationship. He would be asking him questions, and he's sitting there like a good boy, looking all handsome, answering those questions with the exact answers
right
that they wrote for him in advance.
Right. And the Beatles
just completely destroyed all that when they came on the scene. They were like they made it into a farce. They would make fun of their interviewers, and they were like a bunch of teenage boys making fun of each other.
It's so off topic, but why do you think they were so unreserved? Why do you think?
It's because they were genuine. It's because they're honest. I think the greatest. I think it's also if you want to explain some of like Lorde's success or Billie Eilish's success in recent years, if we already touched upon them, is that they also seem to be genuine. They're not like Beyonce. Not to take anything away from Beyonce's talent as a performer and as a singer.
Sure.
But that is like that is the record company's idea of pop music, right? What she's gonna do is gonna always be like the same sort of stuff. And it's going to be very, very, very polished and very, very, there's not a lot of personal message there. And those girls, they come in with their own kind of personal message. They're trying to be themselves.
Right.
Which is a different kind of thing. And that is also something that, in a way, the Beatles made into an option for pop artists. It's on the table. Every pop artist nowadays, they can choose to be bland and poppy and polished and just make something that they know is going to sell a certain amount,
fill the content void,
and going to and in a few years, most people are not going to remember what that was because it all sounds vaguely the same.
Yeah,
but it's always on the table. To put yourself out there, to make yourself vulnerable by being honest.
Wow, that's a great message.
And I think that was Lennon's magic in a way in the Beatles and outside of the Beatles was his complete and brutal honesty. He was always the honest one. He would always be the one who would say, the uncomfortable thing during the interview. And he was always the one who would bear his soul in a way in his, in his songs and his lyrics. He never held anything back. And it sort of infected the other Beatles to behave in the same way, right? They were always genuine. When you look at them, doing interviews and giggling and putting each other down and like being self-deprecating and funny, all of that is genuine. That's the way they actually were in real life. That's everybody who knew them said that. You felt just better as a person for being in their company. Yeah. Because they were so honest and genuine. And that's part of, why they had the impact that they had. They never tried to toe anybody's line. They never listened to anybody's advice. They just basically, they did them. They did them, yes. And they were fine with people not liking what they were doing at any point in time, As Lennon once said in an interview, it's fine if people don't like something that we did, and it's fine that, and it's also, it's their right not to like us, and it's our right not to want to have anything to do with them. That was, I think, his exact quote.
Live and let be.
Yeah, exactly. His approach was, okay, you don't have to like it, and we don't care. Yeah. We don't have to make you like everything that we do.
So let's jump back into Revolver.
Yes, let's jump back into Revolver and the technical aspect of it.
Yeah. What else is interesting that you'd like to share with the audience about the recording of Revolver specifically?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things that I thought I'd mention. One of them is the interesting tidbit that Paul McCartney uncharacteristically did not play on She Said, She Said.
Whatsoever
at all. He does not play on a George Place bass.
Wow.
On a 6-string Fender bass, I think. Because they had a row in the beginning of the session, and he just sort of said, screw you guys, I'm going home. And they recorded the song without him, which is interesting. There's only a couple of songs in the entire Beatles catalog that he's not present on.
Right, he famously plays guitar on other people's he plays the guitar solo on Taxman, right?
Taxman, that's true.
He's playing drums on
he's playing drums
on the White Album, right?
He's playing
everything.
Drums on Back to the USSR and Dear Prudence, yes. And on a couple of other tunes as well. On the Ballad of John and Yoko, that was recorded without Ringo too.
So this is a rare occurrence.
Yeah, this is a rare occurrence, but it's funny, They were really tight back then, and they were. This was not one of the White Album
emo
kind of rows. Yeah, this was just they had
a little feud,
a regular teenage boys kind of fight, and so that's one interesting tidbit. The other one is that they wanted. This one's about the entire album. They wanted to record it in America. They were planning. They actually were planning to record this album in America because they wanted that Motown sound. They wanted that. That was the music they were listening to at the time, as it's also very evident from songs like Good Day Sunshine or I want Got to Get You Into My Life, which is. Which are very Motown sounding, maybe not exactly by the Abbey Road engineers who didn't really know yet how to get that sound down pat. This record stands out more sound-wise on the more rocky guitar-driven tracks, like She Said, and You Bird Can Sing, wonderful sounding. Well, of course, what we already talked about, the monumental tracks, like Eleanor Rigby and Tomorrow Never Knows, which, are this album sort of gave birth to the British rock sound in a way, but they were going to go to America, and they didn't go in the end because Capitol gave them an insane quote for like recording in America. I'm guessing because they were the Beatles, and EMI just refused to